let's start our guessed word tests with the prop types test and the setup function. So in general, we'll start out with those things whenever we start tests for a new component. So let's define default props. And what props is this component going to need? Well, it's going to need that guessed word props from the parent, which will get it from the state. Let's look at our state table to remember what that guessed words piece of state is going to look like. All right, so guessed words is going to be an array of objects, and each of the objects is going to have a shape guessed word, which is a string, so that's the word that was guessed, and letter match count, which is a number, so that is the number of letters that match between the guessed word and the secret word. All right, so that I feel like with that, I can make a default props. So I'll say default props equals, and let's start out with a word in there. I'll say, so we need that guessed words key, because that's what the prop is going to be called. And its value is going to be an array, and that array is going to have an object in it, and it will have guessed word. And we'll say just pulling this out of nowhere, the guessed word will be train, and the letter match count will be 3. Okay, let's see, I think I would actually like this better as formatting. So let's just do this and remove that there and just some formatting cleanup. Okay, so now I have my default props and I can create my setup function. So my setup function is going to take props and it's going to be empty by default. And then we're going to take whatever props we got as the argument to the setup function and lay them over the default props. So I'm going to say the setup props are going to be those default props with whatever the argument props are on top. And again, the reason we're doing this is because we are going to be checking in our prop types to make sure that we have certain required props. And if I just by default use some props in my test, I can avoid getting that warning. And then I'm going to return a shallow wrapper of my guessed words component. Oh, let's JSXify that. My guessed words component with that combined props, the default props and the argument props. Okay. And let me copy and paste my, my JS doc to make my inner JS doc happy. There we go. Now let's add the prop types test. And we've imported check props already from test utils. So the prop type test is not going to be difficult. Let's just say test does not throw warning with expected props. And for this now, we can actually, because we have that default props there, we can just say check props, guessed words, default props. Because remember, check props is taking a component, so we're giving it the guessed words component, and it's taking some props, and it's just checking to see that no error is thrown when we give that component those props. We want to make sure that the default props that we think are going to pass the test for this component actually pass the test. And if they don't, we're actually probably going to have to check all of our code. I should say, if they don't pass that test later, so they pass the test now, but then you find later that they're not passing the test, you're probably going to have to check all of your code that uses the guessed words component and make sure that it's being passed the proper props. All right, so let's see how we're doing. Let's look at our tests. We don't need this anymore. All right, so they're passing, but in this case, that's not so great. We actually don't want this test to be passing because we haven't coded up the props yet. But like I said before, this is a negative test. You're checking to see that no error is thrown. And if no props are defined for this component, then yeah, doesn't matter what props we give it, no error is going to be thrown. So later we're going to make a tweak to our test just to make sure we can see it fail. But for now, we'll leave it. And let's go back to guessed words, the actual component, and let's fill out the prop types. This one has somewhat complicated prop types because we're expecting an array of objects with a particular shape. So this is how it looks. So we want an array of an object that has this shape. And in here, we want it to have a key of guessed word. And we want that to be a string, and it's going to be required. We certainly don't want to look at a guess if we don't know what the word was. We also need to know the letter match count. And that is going to be a number. And that's also required. I want to know if you try and give me an object within the guessed words that doesn't have a letter match count. And to top it all off, this whole guessed words prop is required as well. Okay, so now I've coded this up and our tests are now failing. So let's see. The prop guessed words is marked as required, but its value is undefined. So let's see where I made a mistake in my tests. Another opportunity for a drink for you. So here I have guessed words, and it is in my default props. Oh, my default props I made instead of being an object, I got carried away with my array of objects. So if I take my default props and I make them an object instead of an array of objects, yes, my tests are passing. So that's great. And let's just make sure if we make guessed words be the word phooey, we do get an error. We expected to get an undefined error, but instead we got invalid prop type of type string. It expected an array. Okay, so that's feeling pretty good. I'll see you in the next lecture.